The plate hit the floor before I understood what happened. Mashed potatoes splattered across the tiles like abstract art. Green beans rolling under the cabinet where I'd never be able to reach them without getting on my hands and knees. The pork chop landed grease side down on the linoleum I'd scrubbed just that morning. My fork was still in my hand, hovering over empty air where my dinner had been seconds ago. Calvin stood over me, his face twisted with something I didn't recognize anymore. Something that looked like hatred mixed with disgust. "If you're hungry, old man, get down there and eat it off the floor like the dog you are." His words cut deeper than the arthritis that chewed at my knees every morning. I stared at the mess, steam still rising from what had been a simple Tuesday dinner. Nothing fancy, just the kind of meal I'd cooked for him 1,000 times when he was growing up. My hand trembled around the fork as one thought burned through my shock. This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his mother died, the child I'd sacrificed everything for. How did we get here? The silence after he left felt heavier than his words, pressing down on me like the humidity before a storm. I heard his boots stomping up the stairs, each step shaking the pictures on the wall. The same pictures where he smiled as a boy, holding fishing rods and baseball gloves, his mother's eyes looking out from his young face. I lowered myself slowly to the floor, my knees protesting every inch of the descent, bones grinding against each other in that familiar way that reminded me I wasn't young anymore. Not to eat. I wasn't that broken yet, hadn't lost that last shred of dignity, but to clean up the mess before it stained the floor permanently. The pork chop was ruined, covered in dust and hair from corners I couldn't reach anymore, from spaces where my mop didn't quite fit. I scraped everything into the trash with shaking hands, my stomach empty, but my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. This wasn't the first cruel thing he'd done, wasn't even the worst thing he'd said, but it was the first time I felt genuine fear in my own kitchen, in the house I'd owned for 40 years. I remembered when Calvin was 8 years old, how he'd wait by the front door for me to come home from the factory, his small face pressed against the window glass. His mother had just died from cancer 6 months earlier, and he'd cling to my leg like I was the only solid thing left in a world that had become unpredictable and terrifying. I worked double shifts at the machine shop to keep us afloat, oil under my fingernails and exhaustion in my bones, but I never missed a baseball game or a school play, even when I had to leave work early and lose hours I couldn't afford to lose. I taught him how to change a tire on rainy afternoons in our garage, how to treat people with respect no matter who they were, how to be a man who kept his word and took care of his family. Somewhere between then and now, I'd lost him, watched him transform into someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe he'd lost himself in bottles and bitterness. I sat at the kitchen table with a piece of bread, dry and tasteless, wondering when caring for your child turned into being their victim, when love became a weapon they used against you. The next morning, I decided to test something, to see if the night before had been an aberration or if this was who we were now. I made pancakes the way Calvin loved them, fluffy and golden, with butter melting into the cracks, the recipe his mother had perfected and passed down to me in those last difficult months. I set them on his usual spot at the table before he came downstairs, arranged them carefully like an offering or maybe like bait in a trap. When he appeared, hair messy from sleep, wearing the same clothes he'd slept in, he looked at the plate for a long moment. His face showed nothing, no gratitude, no anger, nothing at all. Then, without a word, he picked up the entire stack with his bare hand and dropped it into the trash can beside the refrigerator. The syrup dripped down the sides of the bag, pooling at the bottom among yesterday's coffee grounds. He turned to me, waiting for a reaction, his eyes challenging me to say something, do something, be the father who would discipline him. I gave him nothing but a blank stare, my face as empty as his had been. His eyes flashed with something like disappointment, as if he wanted me to fight back, so he could escalate, so he could justify whatever he did next. Instead, I turned away and poured myself coffee, my hands steady even though my heart was hammering. That afternoon, Mrs. Bellamy knocked on my door with a container of vegetable soup, the way she did every Thursday like clockwork. She was 75, 3 years older than me, but sharper than most people half her age, with eyes that missed nothing. "Franklin, you're looking thin," she said, studying my face with the kind of concern I hadn't seen from my own family in years. "Is that boy of yours helping you out? Are you eating properly?" I almost told her everything right then and there, about the plate, the pancakes, the way Calvin looked at me like I was something stuck to his shoe that he couldn't wait to scrape off. But shame stopped my tongue, closed my throat around the words that wanted to come pouring out. What kind of father raises a son who treats him this way? What did I do wrong in those years after his mother died? We're managing just fine. I lied, the words tasting bitter. She squeezed my hand with her papery fingers before leaving, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't let anyone make you feel small, Franklin. Not even family. Especially not family, because they're the ones who know exactly where to strike to make it hurt the most. Cleaning the living room later that week, moving slowly because my back had been acting up, I found them. Empty beer bottles shoved under the couch cushions like secrets waiting to be discovered. 6 of them in the couch alone, labels peeled off in nervous strips, hidden in the same way a teenager might hide contraband from their parents. I checked behind the recliner and found 4 more. The recycling bin in the garage held dozens, an ocean of brown glass that explained so much about the past few months. Calvin wasn't just angry. He was drowning himself every night in alcohol, trying to escape something I couldn't see or understand. The smell I'd been ignoring suddenly made sense. That sour, stale scent that clung to the furniture, that hung in the air like smoke, that I'd been attributing to age and dirty carpets. I stood there holding a bottle, turning it in my hands, wondering if the alcohol was making him cruel or if the cruelty was making him drink, if there was even a difference anymore. Either way, I knew this was bigger than me, bigger than both of us. My son was breaking apart, and he was taking me down with him, dragging me into whatever dark place he'd found. Saturday morning, I asked Calvin to drive me to the pharmacy for my prescriptions, my blood pressure medication, and the pills for my arthritis. He agreed with a grunt, not looking up from his phone, and we rode in silence for most of the trip, the radio playing old country songs neither of us really listened to. Halfway there, I gathered my courage like a man preparing to jump into cold water. Son, I found the bottles under the couch. You're drinking too much. Maybe we should talk to someone about it. There are programs, people who can help. He slammed the brakes so hard my seatbelt locked against my chest, knocking the wind out of me. We were pulled over on a side street, houses with neat lawns watching us like an audience. He grabbed my pill bag from my lap and slapped it out of my hands with a violence that made me flinch. Pills scattered across the floor mat, little white and blue circles rolling under the seats, disappearing into places I'd never reach. Don't you ever tell me how to live. You don't know anything about my life, about what I deal with every day. His voice was low and dangerous, vibrating with barely controlled rage. Through the window, I saw a woman on the sidewalk stop and stare, her dog pulling at its leash. The humiliation burned hotter than any anger, shame crawling up my neck like fire. That night, I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer where I kept instruction manuals and receipts and warranty cards for appliances that had long since broken down. I dated the first page in careful handwriting and began writing, my hand cramping around the pen. Tuesday, April 12th. Dinner plate slapped to floor, told to eat off tiles like a dog. Wednesday, April 13th. Pancakes thrown in trash without comment or explanation. Saturday, April 16th. Pills scattered in car, public humiliation, threat about not telling him how to live. Each entry felt like building a wall between me and the chaos, brick by brick, creating something solid I could hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. If this ever went to court, if family ever asked questions, if I needed to prove I wasn't the crazy one, I'd have proof, dates, times, witnesses. The pen felt good in my hand, solid and certain in a way nothing else did anymore. I wasn't losing my mind like Calvin sometimes implied. I was documenting a war I didn't ask for, but was determined to survive, one page at a time. The next evening, I heard Calvin arguing upstairs in his bedroom, his voice carrying through the old heating. Vince, the way sound traveled in this house, the way I used to hear him crying after his mother died. I'm tired of babysitting the old man, he said to whoever was on the phone, his words sharp and clear. I deserve something for all this trouble, for all the years I've wasted in this house. My chest went cold, ice spreading through my veins. Babysitting? I paid every bill in this house from my pension and Social Security. The mortgage had been paid off for 15 years, but there were still utilities and property taxes and insurance. I bought the groceries that he ate without thanking me. I kept the heat running through winters and the air conditioning through summers. Then I heard the words that made my blood freeze in my veins. Don't worry, I'll get the papers signed soon enough. The old fool trusts me. Papers? What papers? I stood at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the railing with white knuckles, staring up at his closed door, wondering what he was planning that required my signature, what documents he needed me to sign. Nothing good, I knew that much. Nothing that would benefit me. The next day, Calvin left for his shift at the warehouse where he worked part-time, irregular hours that never seemed to amount to much in his paycheck. I waited until his truck disappeared down the street, counting to 100 to make sure he wasn't coming back for something he'd forgotten. Then I climbed the stairs to his room, each step an effort, my heart pounding with guilt and necessity. My hands shook as I opened his dresser drawers, feeling like a thief in my own house, violating his privacy in ways I'd never done even when he was a troubled teenager. In the bottom drawer, under old t-shirts that smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, I found a folder with my name printed on the tab in his handwriting. Inside were insurance documents, my life insurance policy that I'd taken out 30 years ago and nearly forgotten about, a small policy meant to cover my funeral expenses. He'd requested payout information, beneficiary details, projected values based on my age and health. There were notes in his handwriting in the margins. Full amount at death. No waiting period, no contestation after 2 years. I felt sick, my stomach turning, while rising in my throat. My own son was betting on my death, maybe even planning for it, calculating how much I was worth dead versus alive. I closed the folder carefully and put everything back exactly as I'd found it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely manage the task. Monday morning, I took the bus downtown to a lawyer's office, riding past familiar streets and buildings I'd known for decades. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked surprised when I asked to speak with someone about elder abuse and financial protection, as if men my age didn't usually walk in with such requests. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Patterson who couldn't have been older than 40, listened without interrupting as I explained everything. The plate, the bottles, the insurance documents, the overheard phone call. When I showed her photos I'd taken of the insurance folder with my phone, my hands shaking so badly the images were slightly blurred, her expression hardened into something professional and dangerous. Mr. Whitman, I need to be frank with you. Your son may be attempting to establish guardianship over you, she said, her voice gentle but firm. If he can prove you're incompetent to handle your own affairs, he controls everything. Your money, your house, your medical decisions, where you live. You become legally his ward, like a child. My stomach dropped, the room spinning slightly. What do? I asked, hating how my voice cracked. We fight, she said simply, steel in her eyes. And we start building your case right now, today. I called my old friend Frank that evening, a man I'd worked beside at the factory for 30 years, who'd been at my wife's funeral and my son's high school graduation. He came over within the hour, still wearing his gardening clothes, dirt under his fingernails. He listened to the whole story while shaking his head, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. Franklin, I've seen this before with my cousin. A man who hits once will hit twice, and harder the next time. They test boundaries until there are none left, he said, leaning forward in his chair. You need evidence that will stand up in court, something undeniable. He suggested recording some of Calvin's outbursts, capturing the threats on tape where they couldn't be dismissed or explained away. It felt like betrayal at first, the idea of recording my own son, of treating him like a criminal in his own home. But then I remembered the feeling of mashed potatoes on the floor, the pills scattered in the car like worthless candy, the insurance documents with their cold calculations of my worth. This wasn't betrayal. This was survival. This was war. We set up a small voice-activated recording device in the kitchen drawer that night, hidden under a stack of dish towels where Calvin would never think to look. It didn't take long for the recorder to capture what I needed. 2 days later, Calvin came home furious about something at work, slamming doors throughout the house like a tornado touching down. He stormed into the kitchen where I was reading the newspaper, trying to stay out of his way, making myself small and invisible. Where's my mail? He demanded, looming over me. I'm expecting a check, a tax refund that should have been here by now. I told him truthfully, carefully, that nothing had come, that the mailbox had been empty except for utility bills and junk mail. He shoved my shoulder hard enough that I nearly fell from the chair, my coffee cup rattling against its saucer. Useless old fool. Can't even handle simple mail. What good are you? The recorder in the drawer caught every word, every threat, the sound of his hand hitting my shoulder, my sharp intake of breath. Later, when I played it back alone in my room with headphones, I heard my own silence. Not weakness, but strategy, the quiet of a man gathering ammunition. I was preparing for a war he didn't know was coming, building a case brick by brick. At my next doctor's appointment, I told Dr. Hammond what had been happening at home, the words spilling out in a rush once I started. She set down her clipboard and looked at me with alarm, her professional mask slipping to show genuine concern. Franklin, I need you to understand something very clearly. You are of sound mind. Your memory is sharp, your judgment is clear, your reasoning is intact. If anyone questions your competence, I will testify to that in any court in this state. She wrote a detailed letter on her official stationery right then, documenting my mental and physical independence, noting my ability to manage my own healthcare and finances, describing me as fully competent and capable of independent living. I folded it carefully into my journal with the other evidence, recordings, photos, dates, times. Calvin thought he could paint me as a confused old man who needed managing, who couldn't be trusted with his own life. But I had a doctor, a lawyer, and recordings that said otherwise. The armor was building, piece by piece, layer by layer, protection against attacks I knew were coming. A week later, Calvin came home drunk again, worse than usual. I heard him before I saw him, crashing through the front door at midnight, knocking over the coat rack, cursing as hangers clattered to the floor. He stumbled into the kitchen where I sat with my evening tea, unable to sleep, reading a book under the dim light. You think you're so smart, don't you? He slurred, leaning over me, his breath reeking of whiskey and something darker, something rotten. Playing the victim, the poor old man everyone should feel sorry for. But I know what you are. His hand grabbed the edge of the table for balance. One day, old man, you won't be able to get back up from one of your falls. And I'll be right there watching, waiting. Maybe I'll call an ambulance. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just let nature take its course. It wasn't anger in his voice anymore. It was a promise, a threat, a glimpse into a future he'd been imagining. My hands clenched into fists under the table, nails digging into my palms, but I kept my face neutral, empty. I'd learned that my silence enraged him more than any words could, that my refusal to react drove him to reveal more than he intended. And rage made him sloppy, made him speak truths he should have kept hidden. I was counting on that sloppiness, banking on his arrogance. The following morning, head clear and purpose driving me, I took the bus to my bank. I met with the manager, a woman I'd known for 15 years, and restructured everything into an irrevocable trust. My pension, my savings, the small amount I'd put aside over the years from my factory work. All of it would bypass Calvin completely if something happened to me. Go to designated charities and individuals who'd shown me more kindness than my own blood. Instead of my son, it would go to organizations that helped seniors, to Mrs. Bellamy for her kindness, to Frank for his loyalty. The banker asked if I was certain, warned me this couldn't be easily undone, that I was essentially disinheriting my only child. I nodded without hesitation, my voice firm. The paperwork made satisfying sounds as she stamped and filed each page. Thunk, 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 like nails being driven into a coffin. I left with a sealed envelope containing copies of everything, addressed to Ms. Patterson for safekeeping. Calvin's plan had just crumbled to dust, and he didn't even know it yet. Was probably home sleeping off his hangover, dreaming of money he'd never see. That knowledge felt like sunshine breaking through clouds after years of rain. That evening, I set the table deliberately, with purpose and ceremony. 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, both loaded with pork chops and vegetables. A mirror of that first terrible night that had started everything, that had opened my eyes to who my son had become. I sat down and waited, hands folded, breathing steady. Calvin came downstairs at his usual time, saw the setup, and that familiar smirk crossed his face, the expression of a bully who thinks he's found another opportunity to assert dominance. He moved toward my plate, hand rising in slow motion like he was going to slap it away again, repeat the humiliation, remind me of my place in his world. But this time, I caught his wrist mid-air, my grip steady and strong, strengthened by weeks of quiet fury and determination. My fingers closed around his arm like iron, holding him frozen. His eyes went wide with surprise, genuine shock crossing his face. For the first time in months, I saw something other than contempt flash through his expression. I saw uncertainty, confusion, a question forming. When did the old man get his strength back? He tried to pull away, but I held on for 3 long seconds before releasing him, each second a statement, a reclamation of power. I leaned in close enough that he couldn't mistake my words, close enough that I could smell the fear mixing with the alcohol on his breath. Touch my food again, and you'll answer to more than just me. I've made sure of that. There are people who know what's been happening here, people with power and authority who are watching now. My voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it more frightening than any shout could have been. Calvin blinked, his mouth opening and closing without sound like a fish pulled from water, searching for words that wouldn't come. Then he yanked his arm away with more force than necessary, stumbled backward, and stormed back upstairs, his footsteps heavy and uncertain. But I'd seen it, the crack in his armor, the moment he realized I wasn't the helpless old man he'd been tormenting for months, that something had shifted in the balance of power between us. I ate my dinner slowly, deliberately, savoring every bite, knowing he was upstairs trying to figure out what had changed, what I knew, what trap he might have walked into. Everything had changed. I'd just fired the first real shot in a war he didn't know was happening, and I was winning. The letter arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered by certified mail that required my signature. It was from a lawyer I'd never heard of, a firm downtown with an impressive letterhead, representing Calvin Whitman in a petition for guardianship over Franklin Whitman due to concerns about mental competence and self-care abilities. The language was clinical, cold, describing me as a vulnerable adult who could no longer manage his own affairs safely. My hands didn't shake as I read it. I'd been expecting this move, had prepared for it. I walked directly to Ms. Patterson's office with the letter, my recordings on a USB drive, my doctor's note, my journal documenting months of abuse. She spread everything across her desk like a general reviewing battle plans, nodding with satisfaction. "This is actually good," she said, which surprised me. He's shown his hand too early. He's filed before building a real case. Now we show ours, and it's going to be devastating for him. She filed a response that afternoon, comprehensive and brutal. The court date was set for 3 weeks away, May 15th at 10 in the morning. I had 3 weeks to finish what I'd started, 3 weeks to gather the final pieces of evidence that would destroy his petition and his credibility. I spent those weeks gathering witnesses like a farmer gathering crops, careful and methodical. Mrs. Bellamy agreed immediately to testify about my independence, about seeing me maintain my house and garden, about our conversations that proved my mental clarity. Frank signed a detailed statement about my mental clarity and Calvin's escalating behavior, describing incidents he'd witnessed personally. Even my pharmacist, a kind man named Tom who I'd been visiting independently for 6 years, wrote a letter confirming my regular, unassisted visits, my ability to manage my own medications, my coherent conversations about my health. My doctor prepared her testimony, gathered my medical records showing consistent self-care and attendance at appointments. Each person who stepped forward felt like reinforcement arriving before a battle, cavalry cresting the hill. I organized everything in a binder with color-coded tabs and chronological dates, cross-referenced and indexed. Miss Patterson was impressed, called it the most thorough documentation she'd seen in 20 years of practice. "Most people don't prepare like this," she said, flipping through pages. "Most people aren't fighting for their lives," I replied quietly. She smiled grimly, understanding in her eyes. We both knew what was really at stake here. Not just money or property, but my dignity, my autonomy, my right to exist without terror in my own home, my right to die as myself rather than as someone's legal property. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, but somehow intimate. Calvin sat with his lawyer, wearing a suit I'd never seen before, probably borrowed or rented for the occasion. He looked confident, even righteous, sitting up straight and nodding solemnly, like he was a concerned son saving his poor confused father from himself. His lawyer painted me as forgetful, unable to manage medications properly, a danger to myself who'd burned food and forgotten appointments that had never been scheduled. They had no real evidence, just insinuations and carefully worded concerns, vague statements that couldn't be pinned down. Then Ms. Patterson stood up, moving with the confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. She played the recording. Calvin's voice, harsh and threatening, crystal clear through the courtroom speakers, calling me useless, shoving me, promising I wouldn't get back up one day. The courtroom went completely silent except for his recorded voice. Even the clerk stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keyboard. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to disturbed, his eyebrows drawing together. Calvin's face drained of all color, going from confident tan to sickly gray. He hadn't known I'd recorded him, hadn't imagined his private cruelty would become public record. That was his first mistake. His biggest mistake was underestimating me. Miss Patterson submitted Dr. Hammond's letter, reading key passages aloud to the silent courtroom. She presented the pharmacist's statement, testimony from Mrs. Bellamy describing my active, independent life, Frank's account of my mental clarity, and his concerns about Calvin's behavior. She walked the judge through my bank records showing decades of responsible financial management, my consistent bill payments, my organized tax returns. She showed photos of my vegetable garden with rows of healthy plants, my organized home with clean surfaces and maintained systems, my paid bills filed chronologically in labeled folders. By the end, Calvin's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, shuffling papers aimlessly. The judge didn't even take a recess to consider, didn't need time to deliberate. Petition for guardianship denied, he said firmly, his voice carrying through the courtroom. Furthermore, I'm issuing a formal warning to Mr. Calvin Whitman regarding suspected elder abuse under Ohio state law. If further incidents are reported, criminal charges will be filed. This court takes such matters very seriously. Calvin sat frozen in his chair, his expensive borrowed suit suddenly looking like a costume, like a child playing dress-up. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction, clean and pure. This wasn't over yet. I had one more move to make. We returned home in separate vehicles. I'd taken the bus because I'd known what was coming. He'd driven that truck I'd helped him buy 3 years ago with money I should have saved. When he walked through the door, I was waiting at the kitchen table with a manila envelope, legal-sized and official. He looked at it like it might explode, suspicion and fear warring on his face. "What's that?" he asked, voice flat and careful. "Open it," I said simply. Inside was an eviction notice, prepared by Ms. Patterson, legal and binding, and filed with the county. He had 30 days to vacate the premises under Ohio landlord-tenant law. His face went from pale to red in seconds, anger flooding back as his default response. "You can't do this. This is my home too," he shouted, spittle flying. "I just did," I replied calmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "This is my house. My name is on the deed, has been for 40 years. You're an adult who tried to steal my independence and my money, who threatened my safety in my own home. You have 30 days. The law is very clear on this." He crumpled the paper, threw it at me where it bounced off my chest, but we both knew it didn't matter. He could tear up 50 copies and the law wouldn't change. The eviction was filed, recorded, official. This was my house, and he was no longer welcome in it. The next month was tense but quiet, the house holding its breath. Calvin moved through the rooms like a ghost, packing boxes with angry efficiency, making phone calls in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact. I heard him on the phone trying to find places to stay, heard him being turned down by friends who'd heard about the court case. On his final night, May 15th, I cooked dinner one last time. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, prepared exactly as I had that first terrible night. The same meal from that first terrible night that started everything. I set 2 plates at the table with care, positioning everything symmetrically. He came downstairs, saw the setup, and hesitated in the doorway, unsure. But hunger or curiosity, or maybe just exhaustion brought him to the chair. We ate in complete silence, the only sound our forks against plates and the old clock ticking on the wall. I watched him chew slowly, mechanically, his eyes distant. He'd lost weight over the past month, looked older somehow, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Part of me still remembered the 8-year-old boy who'd hugged my leg and called me his hero, who'd cried in my arms when his mother died. But that boy was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust anymore, someone who'd shown me exactly who he was. I let him finish every bite before I spoke, let the silence build until it was almost unbearable. I set down my fork with a deliberate click and folded my hands on the table, the same gesture I'd used when teaching him lessons as a child. "Do you remember the night you slapped my plate onto the floor?" I asked quietly, my voice carrying in the silent kitchen. He didn't answer, just stared at his empty dish, jaw working. "That was the night you stopped being welcome at this table. That was the night you chose cruelty over family, violence over love. I gave you everything I had, my time when I was exhausted from factory work, my money when I had little to spare, my love even when you pushed it away. And you repaid me by planning to have me declared incompetent so you could control what little I had left, so you could cash in on my death." My voice didn't waver, strengthened by righteous anger and relief. "I want you to remember this moment, son. Remember that your father wasn't the helpless old fool you thought he was. Remember that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn through actions and choices. And you lost it. You threw it away like garbage." The next morning, I watched through the window as he loaded his truck with boxes and garbage bags, his movements jerky and angry. He didn't knock on the door to say goodbye, didn't turn back to look at the house one last time. He just drove away, gravel crunching under his tires. The house was quiet after he left, truly quiet for the first time in years, not the tense quiet of waiting for an explosion, but the peaceful quiet of safety. I made myself breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, and sat at my clean table and ate every bite in peace. I'd won more than a legal battle or a property dispute. I'd won my dignity back, reclaimed the self-respect I'd been losing piece by piece. And I swore, looking at my reflection in the kitchen window with morning light streaming through, that I would never let anyone, not even my own blood, make me feel less than human again. Some wars are worth fighting, even when they break your heart. Especially then. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.